rather. Good, welcome to all our guests joining in this afternoon. We're so excited for our fifth and final webinar. And today we have Candace, and she's going to speak about recruiting for managers and really taking a practical approach to look at what steps you guys can take and what really works well in the whole process of looking for managers to recruit. So it is my honor to introduce Candace to you all. So she is a client development consultant at Thomas International South Africa, and she's a registered industrial psychologist with a passion for leadership development and team effectiveness. So Candace has experience working with management, with teams, with executives, and really with a strong emphasis on empowerment. And Candace has worked in several industries such as mining and retailing, and continuing to broaden her scope as she goes. So Candace is also a member of the International Golden Key Society, and you guys are in really good hands this afternoon with Candace and all her expertise that she's going to share with you. So we would just like to invite you to please ask questions throughout the webinar. You can just pop your questions into the chat box, and then we will address the questions at the end of the session. So please participate with us. Please send those questions through just to get the conversation going a bit, and enjoy. So Candace, over to you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Elna. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited to present the very last installment of our Recruitment Journey webinar series, which is, as Elna mentioned, Recruiting for Managers, a Practical Application. So thank you for joining us today. So what we're going to chat about is, I'm going to take you back to the 5 stages of recruitment that we had a look at in webinar number 2 with Ronaldo, where we're going to look at it through the lens of recruiting for a manager specifically. We're going to start off with defining the role. Then we're going to move on to the second stage, which is attracting the right candidate. Then we're going to look at assessment and selection, appointing the right person quickly, and lastly, we're going to end off with a little bit of onboarding. So as Elna mentioned, if you've got questions that pop up throughout the webinar, please pop them in the chat box and we can have a discussion afterwards. So the first stage is clearly defining the vacant role. Now, when we're defining the vacant role, when we're looking at a managerial position, it is all about behavior. We're no longer only focusing on those functional tick boxes that we're trying to get done. It's not only about qualifications and experience and what this person has done in the past. Yes, those things are important, but that's not what we should only be looking at. It's all about behavior at the end of the day. That is really what's going to make or break whether your potential new manager is going to make it or not. It's not often that you see a position that's advertised that says seeking a manager to manage a team that is very good at motivating themselves. They are very good at reaching their targets and things like that. You don't often see that in an ad, and that's because we're not always focused on it, but we really should be. We mustn't forget about that team. What is that team looking like? How do they want to be motivated? How do they want to be communicated with? Often the recruiters fall into the trap of not focusing on that enough. And then sometime down the line, you see things aren't working out. And that's because we didn't define things properly right in the beginning. And lastly, culture fit. Culture fit has been one of the main reasons that managers or newly appointed managers don't work out. Look at the culture that you want this person to emphasize. What is it, the values, or which values, which vision, which purpose is it that you want your manager to naturally emphasize as an individual when stepping into your company? It is a very big part of their success. You want your new manager to promote the things that you want them to promote. So add this into your job ad. The more a manager can see what it is that you want them to do, the more likely they're able to identify with it and say, you know what, that is me. I think I can do this. I want to work for this company. It's all about that fit. Now, recruiters or HR practitioners usually make the mistake of not including these things in the beginning, or only talking about them when you get to interview stage, or not really talking about them at all. It's usually just a tick and a tick and a tick here and there, but not looking at a holistic picture. So I'm sure you can all relate back to a situation where the person was perfect on paper, but then a few months down the line, things aren't going how you thought they would. And it's maybe because when you focused on your job ad in the beginning, you focused on the wrong things. And we've all fallen into that trap. But now it's about reflecting and looking at your current job ads to say, okay, but what is it that we are looking for? Are we focusing on the right things? And more importantly, to get your panel on board to make sure that they're focusing on the right things too, because that's often quite a significant roadblock that a lot of recruiters sit with, because the panel is so focused on those check boxes that we are used to during recruitment. Now, defining what you set out at the beginning is probably what you're going to get at the end. So to be sure to define the things as carefully as what you can from the beginning to make sure that you are focused on the right things throughout the entire process. And that's why planning is so important. Now, I completely understand that planning is an absolute luxury when it comes to the recruitment process, and that's 100% fine. But if you do have a little window to plan a little bit, these are the things that are going to help you to set yourself up for success and getting the best manager with the resources that you have at your disposal. So budget goes without saying. Recruitment costs money, and we know how much that is. So make sure that you're able to budget as much as you can, as much as you are able to make sure that if something does happen and you have a manager that ups and leaves, you are ready to tackle that. Next, what is your timeline looking like? And again, does your panel know the timeline, as well as the process, what's going on? How is the recruitment process going to work? Especially is something to take into account is, do you have capacity for a second interview should you need one? If you have not found that right manager yet, make sure that you have the time for that. Often what we end up doing, because we don't have much of a choice, is we sacrifice the right candidate for a deadline. I'm sure you've all been in situations where the hiring manager will say to you, well, my current manager is leaving at the end of October, so we need this person to start at the beginning of October so that there's a handover process, and then we're scrambling to find the right candidates so that they can start on the right date and work out their notice periods, and then there's not a lot of time for anything else as well. And this is where I feel we need to be a little bit more strict and a little bit more firm with that hiring manager to say, well, what would you like to have? A person start on the right date, or would you like the right person to start on my date? And I'll show you a little bit, with a little bit of research, why that is. And lastly, try to keep your eye on the team. And I'll show you just now what I mean when I say keep your eye on the team. Make sure your ear is to the ground within the organization. What is this team going through? What are their potential struggles? Or what are they doing really, really well at? Because should that team's manager up and leave, you want to know without having to spend too much time researching it or doing your investigation. You want to know what's going on with that team off the bat. So if you still, my apologies, if you still don't think that planning is something that you have the time for, maybe I can convince you with a little bit of research. So a study from the Business Insider found different reasons why people left, and this information was gathered through your exit interviews, where people tend to be a little bit more honest than your initial interview because they're leaving. And the most significant reason that we found was a lack of engagement. People left because they no longer felt engaged with the organization, with their manager, with their team, so they upped and left. Next, a lack of career growth. This is becoming an increasingly more important point, especially when we're looking at the younger population. The study also found that younger people are very easily or very more willing to up and leave a company if they feel that they are not growing or they're not developing as they would like to or as they see fit. The days are gone of people spending 30, 40 years in a company because of loyalty. We're seeing a very big shift with the different generations in terms of people are chasing value now. They're no longer chasing tenure, which is what it used to be. And then third on the list is being underpaid. Now, back in the day, this also used to be something that used to be quite high on the list. But what we're seeing now is that people equate payment to worth, to say, well, if I'm not being paid what I think I'm worth, then I'm being undervalued, or my worth isn't being recognized. And naturally, people will go to where they feel that their contribution is worthy. Next, relationships with managers and or co-workers. Again, all that more important to have a look at what your team is looking like. What kind of relationships do they want to have with their managers? What kinds of relationships are they going to value? And are there any potential conflicts within a team that manager might need to work out? Lack of management recognition. This is quite a big one as well. And a lot of managers really struggle with giving recognition, not because they don't want to, but it's because they're not entirely sure how to do it correctly. And the secret is to recognize people in a way that they want to be recognized. And the only way you're going to find that out is to ask them and to find out, what is it that's important to you? How do you want to be recognized? Have that conversation. Again, when you're recruiting for a manager, during the recruitment process or during your interview, those are things that you're going to want to probe for. Is this something that they take seriously, and what is their approach to it? Next was feeling bored or unchallenged. Now, there is nothing worse than sitting in an organization or sitting in a position where you feel that you can contribute more, but you aren't being, or there aren't the opportunities to challenge yourself or to put your hand up for different projects, and feeling like, well, you know what, I can contribute a little bit more somewhere else. And lastly was a lack of contribution to the overall company goal. Again, people want to feel like they're making a difference to something. Again, that study showed that people are chasing value. They want to add value to a company, to a purpose, to a vision. It's no longer just, well, I'm here because I like or because I want a salary and I need to feed my family. It's becoming a lot more of a deeper connection to what we're doing every day. So as I mentioned, this is especially important with your younger employees, and especially with those Generation Zs that are coming into the workforce at the moment. For them, what we found is that career growth is at the top of their list as being the most important thing. And if that isn't being emphasized, or they aren't given that opportunity, they are very comfortable to up and leave. It isn't as big a choice for them as what it was, or what it might be for the rest of us. But again, it doesn't really matter what demographic you're in. Career development and career growth, you can be rest assured that it's always going to be very important. So I've spoken about the team, but what is it that you need to look for in a team? What are the things that you need to take note of that's going to help you to define that vacant role that you've got? So the first thing is motivators. So motivators can be twofold. It is what's going to motivate that team and how to motivate that team. Again, look at how does your manager naturally approach other people and how do they naturally motivate other people? And then look at your team and say, well, my team likes to be motivated in this way. And then how do those two marry together? Next is communication preferences. Different people want to be communicated to in different ways. So if you have a manager that has a natural communication preference for your team, chances of success for that manager is becoming significantly better. Team aspirations. So if your manager knows what the individuals want to achieve as well as what that team is aspiring to, having a manager that's going to inspire them and promote that, again, the chances of success are becoming a lot better. Team fears. Now, fears don't refer to things like I'm scared of retrenchment or I'm scared of being bored. It looks to things like a fear of failure or a fear of rejection, those kinds of internal fears. And we often see this with sales teams. Sales teams have a very high focus on the end target, naturally, because that's what they need to do. So when they don't reach that target, the fear of failing might be a little bit more overwhelming for them, or it might be a little bit more present for them than what it might be for other people. Now, if you have a manager that has that understanding, and might share the same fear or might understand why that fear might be there, they might be able to help that team cope, or they might be able to help that team mitigate those fears. So it's important to know what your team is valuing. And lastly, team focus. Having an understanding of what your team is focused on and making sure that that manager is able to align their focus or perhaps shares that same focus, again, is going to increase the chances of success. So now that we know what to include in our definition of that vacant managerial role, we need to have an understanding of, okay, how do I now find that person? Or how do I now attract that person? And it all comes down to what you are selling. So for a management position, the benefits and the salary is a given. You know that your salary is going to be market related. You know that those fringe benefits are going to be included because it is a management position. So if that's all that you're selling, then it might not be your strongest selling point. So try to define those challenges that comes with that management role. This is going to help really sell the value of that position that you're offering that individual. For example, it could sound something like seeking a manager that needs to inspire a team that has been struggling to meet their KPIs, or anything like that, or seeking a manager to come in and set up a whole new department, or whatever your challenge might be at that point in time. Phrasing things like that or advertising things like that is probably going to be quite inspiring to someone who might feel a little bit stuck in their current role, feeling like they can add more and they can contribute more. Seeing that might inspire and excite someone to apply for that position and say, well, I think I can inspire that team. I want to know more. I want to come and work for your company. And that's the kind of excitement that you want in a new manager. Next is promote your vision. Be proud of your company. Be proud of what it is that you want to achieve. The more proud and the more prominent you are about your vision and your purpose as an organization or as a team or whatever it is, the more likely that person is going to see that and be able to relate to that. If they don't relate to it and if they don't buy into it, then you know that that person isn't for you and that's not your right candidate. Then keep looking. Thirdly, and this is probably something that you would want to add into your planning if you have the time for it, is to put yourself into your new manager's shoes or your potential manager's shoes. So once you've defined your role and you're ready to advertise it and attract that right candidate, ask a third party, maybe someone that's separate from your recruitment team or in a different department, maybe even a friend or a family member. Show them your ad and ask them, what do you think that paint me a picture of the type of candidate that you think I'm looking for. Or does this ad excite you? Does it look like an exciting challenge? And if they say no, and if the picture that they paint for you is different to what you're trying to achieve, then maybe reevaluate and maybe ask them for their input or ask someone else for what they think you should be adding in there. It's always nice to get a fresh set of eyes to see something that you might be missing. And then lastly, avail yourself. So remember, your job ad isn't going to be a dissertation on your ideal candidate. It's going to be punchy. It's probably going to be shorter, than most things. So be available for the individual if they want to phone you and ask you certain questions. Remember, and I think this is something that we often neglect, is that when we are stepping out of one company and entering into another, or stepping out of one team and entering into another, the decision to do that is quite a hefty one. So it's one that shouldn't be taken lightly. So allow yourself the time to be there for that person and to address their questions should they have any. So it's going to help you to also I beg your pardon. It's going to help you to get to know that candidate and to see whether or not that candidate is potentially the right one for you. So remember, you might be doing the interviewing, but it's also that person that's going to be interviewing you and interviewing your company to see whether or not your company in that position is one that they want to be in. So let's talk about interviews for a second. Have you ever heard something like this, or have you ever heard your panel say things like this? Interviews are definitely the most important part of recruitment. You can tell all you need to know from an interview. This candidate really wowed us in the interview. This candidate didn't really present well in the interview. And lastly, This candidate was so nervous. If you start hearing things like this, then you know that your focus isn't 100% correct. Now, my wonderful colleague Larissa in the very first webinar showed us that it takes 0.1 seconds to make a first impression. And as human beings, we're so comfortable to let that first impression formulate our opinions of other people. And this is especially true when it comes to interviews. Our hiring managers are very comfortable to rely on the interview to say, you know what, I saw all I needed to know, and that's about it. Yes, interviews are very important and they do show us quite a bit, but it might not be everything. So Alna, I'm going to ask you to please launch a poll for us now. So the poll is going to ask you, what was the most stressful situation you've ever found yourself in? Spending a weekend with your in-laws, doing your taxes, being trapped in an elevator, public speaking, getting a root canal, planning a wedding, moving, looking for a job, getting a divorce, or going through a breakup, or a death of a loved one. What would you say is the most stressful one? Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to go through that. Okay, I'll know when everybody has answered. You are welcome to share that with us. Okay, thank you so much, Alna. Okay, so we've got some responses here. So I see that looking for a job is 29% and public speaking is also 29%. So those were our two highest. And then of course the unfortunate death of a loved one, 21%, so also pretty much up there, and then the rest are kind of split. So that's quite interesting to see, considering the research that we found agrees with you. So what we found is that spending a weekend with your in-laws, only 35% of people said, oh, you know what, this was extremely stressful for me. Or planning a wedding, 78 people said, you know what, this is the most stressful thing that I've ever been in. But 83% of people said looking for a job was one of the most stressful things that they've ever been in. And you yourself are able to corroborate that to say, you know what, that is a super stressful time. Now, think back to that time when you were so stressed. Are you 100% confident with every response that you gave, whether it was a communicative one or a behavioral one? Are you happy with every single choice that you made? So we're putting so much pressure or so much emphasis onto this interview when these poor people are so stressed. And then we're relying on all of that subjective data to make such an important hiring decision. So that's why it's even more important to bring more objective data into it. And that brings us to assessments and selection. Now, you have seen this iceberg in all of the other webinars, so I'm not going to hammer onto it too much, but that observable behavior that you see in that interview, that's coming from the top of the iceberg. So we need to dig a little bit deeper and look a little bit and say, okay, but what's more consistent? Attitudes, values, beliefs, and personality, to really get an objective picture of that individual. So this becomes even more important when you are recruiting internally. And the reason for that is because we found that about 62% of companies use performance appraisals when they are promoting individuals to management positions. Now, your experience might be different, but our experience shows that performance appraisals aren't really the best source of objective data. Often they're not done very fairly, and if they are done in a semi-fair manner, the criteria that's used to evaluate performance isn't objective in itself. So using that already introduces quite a bit of bias. And then secondly, 50% of companies use senior manager recommendations. Now, again, we also know that we gravitate to people who are like us. So I'm likely to recommend someone that I spend a lot of time with because I choose to, because I enjoy them and I'm like them. So I know what their work looks like, but I might not necessarily give the same amount of time to someone who's very different from who I am. So I don't allow myself the opportunity to see what their work is looking like, because I don't usually spend a lot of time with them. So again, you can see there is a great deal of risk and bias within that situation or using that method as well. So again, relying on that objective data, whether it is internal recruitment or external recruitment, is equally as important. So the PPA. So again, the PPA really has been spoken about quite a bit in our previous webinars. But just to recap, it looks at work-related behavioral preferences, preferred communication styles, motivators, fears, and we're going to talk about teams in a second. So again, this is at the top of the iceberg. It's observable. The PPA is going to give you insight into whether or not that individual aligns with those behavioral requirements that you highlighted when you defined the role. Again, focusing that role right at the beginning and focusing those requirements thoroughly right at the beginning is going to help you to pick out the information that you need from the assessments that you're doing. Okay, so let's talk about the team. We have a report called the Team Audit, and those of you who are currently using our PPA system might have seen it before. So how this works is you take an individual, or you take everybody's PPA from a team, and the hub system collates it together to create the actual team. So the report is going to talk about information such as the team's culture, the team's strengths and possible limitations, the team's reaction to change, the value that the team is going to bring to the organization, and lastly, what is the preferred leader going to look like for that team? So the information is presented to you. So if you struggle and you say, well, I'm not entirely sure what kind of manager this team needs, pull your team audit report because it's going to be there for you. You can take the information straight out of there and you can pop it into your job ad. Now, again, this really has been spoken about beforehand, but within the PPA, it uses the DISC theory, so dominance, influence, steadiness, and compliance. And there is a reminder for you of the profile characteristics for each factor. Now, when we are looking at recruiting a manager versus the behavioral requirements of the team, we're very comfortable to fall into the stereotype of certain factors can lead and certain factors can't. That's 100% not true. For example, a very popular one is you have to have dominance if you're going to be a manager. There's absolutely no way about it. We absolutely need someone that's going to be driving, competitive, forceful, inquisitive, direct, self-starter, and assertive. We're very comfortable to rely on that stereotype because that's what we think we need. But that's not necessarily what we need to do here. For example, if you have a team and you've pulled your team audit report and the team shows that they have very high compliance. So in other words, this team is driven by policy. They're going to come across as very compliant, careful, systematic, precise, accurate. They're going to come across as perfectionists and logical. They want to make sure that whatever they take on is going to be perfect. They are very focused on the process and making sure that that quality element is there. Now, an individual with dominance isn't necessarily going to emphasize those things. They're more focused on getting the result at the end of the day, not really focused on the detail in terms of how to get there. So if your new manager is someone with dominance, they're going to emphasize what they're focused on because that's how human beings behave. Whereas the team with compliance is looking for that detail, they're looking for that process. So if you're going to rely on that stereotype in terms of, well, manager needs dominance and that's what we're looking for, you might be setting your manager up for failure because of their behavioral preferences. Now, importantly, we don't just want to recruit the same profile types to say, well, my team has compliance, therefore I need compliance in a manager. It goes back to whether or not your team has an understanding of behavior and an understanding of different approaches and different styles. The same story applies for the manager. Does that manager understand how his behavior is going to affect his team and how his or her focus on different things are going to impact that team? It comes to having a compassion and an understanding for different people's behavioral types and whether or not they are able to adapt their styles given who they are talking to or who they are leading or who they're working with. And this is achieved through a team workshop if that understanding is not there yet, and we'll chat about that a little bit later. However, let's get a bit of a deeper picture. And this is where we go to emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, and this also was introduced in the previous webinars as well, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but more in terms of how to apply it. So this gives us insight into your potential manager's capacity to manage their own emotions as well as the emotions of other people. It also gives us insight into how well is that potential manager going to understand their emotions as well as the emotions of other people. It shows how they're going to behave towards your team that you're recruiting a manager for. For example, let's say you do recruit a manager, or you're considering a manager that has a high dominance within their profile. So as you remember, those profile characteristics: assertive, forceful, driving, a self-starter. But say, for instance, their emotional intelligence profile or their TQ profile shows that, just like this, assertiveness is within the less than most others range. It shows that that forceful nature might not quite be as forceful as what you might anticipate it to be. And that's how dominance can sometimes look different. And that's just using dominance as an example there. So again, it's not as black and white as trying to copy and paste the team's results versus your new manager's results. In other words, if your team is a team that has overall low assertiveness, it doesn't mean that you now need to recruit a manager that also has low assertiveness to make sure that there is an understanding. It doesn't work like that at all. And also, we're not trying to get complete opposites so that we get a balance. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get a balance of the TQ, but more specifically, we need to have a look at how are the different traits going to interact. So for example, if we have a look at adaptability. So adaptability looks at how comfortable are you working through times of change, and how comfortable are you with change in general. So say, for instance, you're recruiting a manager for a team where you need this manager to come in and shake things up because this team is stagnant and they're not achieving their targets, or whatever the situation might be. So you're going to look for a manager that has adaptability within the more than most others range. But say, for instance, your team's overall TQ and their overall adaptability is within the less than most others range. They're going to come across as being a little bit more rigid and not really all that comfortable with change as what your potential new manager might be. So then you need to question your initial assumption to say, well, is adaptability in the more than most others range still needed given the nature of my team? How are these two profiles going to interact? And that's exactly how to use your TQ when you are recruiting for a new manager. And again, using that information of your existing team when you are recruiting a new manager. So we also did another study where we saw that there are specific traits that relate specifically to leadership and being a successful leader. And the first one that we found was emotion perception. So results show that leaders with a higher emotion perception, which looks at the capacity to perceive and understand your own emotions as well as the emotions of other people, they are able to lead with a greater sense of voice and togetherness. Now, voice and togetherness are two elements of our engagement survey. And we saw that earlier on, engagement or a lack thereof was one of the main reasons why people leave their companies. So this suggests that if leaders are able to recognize those subtle emotional reactions and adjust their style accordingly in order to motivate their team, they're able to facilitate a greater sense of trust and cooperation, resulting in employees being more likely to express their ideas and opinions, and they're more likely to feel appreciated. The second one that we found is emotion regulation. So when leaders are able to regulate their emotional responses, employees report a greater sense of clarity around their objectives and their purposes at work. This implies that leaders who are able to remain calm and composed are likely to communicate more clearly when delegating goals and tasks, and they trust their staff with more autonomy. And then the last one is optimism. So we found that when leaders or leaders who are able to see the positive, even in the negative, and who view the future more positively, they had staff who reported a higher sense of growth and challenge. And again, we saw earlier how important growth and challenge is, especially for your younger employees. But again, growth and challenge is always important no matter the demographic that you fall in. So if leaders are more adept in seeing the opportunities in most situations and including times of stress, such as what we're going through at the moment, this may allow your team to better understand how, or this may allow your new manager to better understand how your team can contribute to successful outcomes based on their strengths, okay, and provide them for opportunities for that development. So using the PPA and using the TQ already provides you with a wealth of information. However, it might not answer all the questions that we need to know. And such questions are, what is the probability of this person being a successful leader? So again, think back to that situation where on paper your candidate was ideal and perfect, but why didn't they pan out the way you thought they might have? Next, how well will they cope in stressful situations? Do they have a strong work ethic? Are they comfortable with the unknown? Are they open to new ways of working? Hashtag COVID. How do they deal with difficult conversations? How will they thrive in a competitive environment if you're working in a competitive environment? And next, what leadership training would they benefit from, if any? And this is where our high potential trait indicator comes from. Now, Elna introduced this one to you last week as well, and she gave you a beautiful overview of the different traits. So I'm not going to jump into them too much. However, we did find that conscientiousness, the trait in the top right-hand corner, is consistently the biggest predictor of subjective and objective career success. Adjustment was also in there in that basket, but it wasn't as consistent as what conscientiousness was, and curiosity as well. It was also up there with those predictors as well. So this really rounds off the picture and shows you and gives you a little bit more of a long-term confidence in terms of, well, I know my manager and this is how they're going to behave, but where can this person go? What kind of potential am I working with? Now, potential is one of those things that you can't see in an interview. So if you hear those kinds of interview phrases come up and say, well, you know what, I think this person is going to be great. I saw what I needed to know. Did you though? It might always be a good idea to dig a little bit deeper and find out exactly what it is that you need to know. Okay. And that brings us to selection. So now we've got this holistic picture of all of our managerial candidates. Now, how do we choose? So we need to refer back to the different things to take into account. So the first thing is, don't forget about your team. Look at that team audit report. What does the team need? What kind of leader is really going to bring out the strengths of that team? Everybody has a basket of strengths within them, but it takes the right manager to bring that out of those people. Next, what is that type of leader needed? And that's going to come from that team audit report. Look at your TQ. Your TQ fills out that picture of how this person is going to interact consistently throughout the period of time. HPTI, again, looking at that leadership potential. You cannot appoint a leader without knowing what their leadership potential is. And lastly, think back to those panel members. Panel members always kind of need to be buffered throughout the recruitment process from start to end, and they kind of need to be herded in terms of, are you making sure you're taking the right things into account? Think of the team, think of this, think of that, and always challenge them when they're relying on their own subjective opinions. So this brings us to the fourth stage of the recruitment and selection wheel, which is appointing the right person quickly. Now, this kind of contradicts everything that I said, and that's true because a management decision should not be quick at all. We saw earlier all those reasons for why people leave, and all of those reasons are significantly, if not solely, affected by the manager that's leading those people. So if you're going to make a quick decision and rely on a deadline and not necessarily getting the right person, then you might find yourself with more recruitment on your plate because you're going to need to replace those people that left because of the negative impact of that wrong hiring decision. So this is a time for reflection. Again, I know this is very much a luxury in recruitment. but you'll thank yourself later on for taking the time to reflect accurately. So the things to reflect on is, did you plan correctly? Did you plan for taking all of the things into account? Did you meticulously go through every step? Next, did you take the right factors into account? So if you think back to that selection slide, did you take the team audit, the TQ, the HPTI, and did you look at all of those things? Next, is my panel objective enough? So in other words, are you challenging your panel enough? And then lastly, do you need a second interview? If you're not 100% confident with your decision and a second interview isn't necessarily in your timeline, try to make sure that you can convince your panel that you need a second interview. Again, it's just going to help you corroborate your initial decision. And then the last phase of recruitment is induction into the role, team, and culture. Now, Ronaldo gave us a beautiful second webinar on onboarding, but I'm just going to touch on a few points with regards to onboarding a new manager. So the first thing is, best leaders fit the culture. And again, a culture is not something you can touch, but it's something you can feel and experience. So when a manager enters into your workplace, make sure that you are promoting the things, or you're talking the language that you want your new manager to talk as well. Get them into the culture from day one. Next, autonomy is key. Give that manager the freedom to get to know their team in a way that they want to get to know them. It's going to help establish that sense of authority, and it's going to help that team get used to that new manager. A team is very comfortable, or individuals are very comfortable to compare. So my old manager did this. Why are we not doing it like this anymore? We're very set in our ways and we're comfortable in our comfort zone. That's why it's called a comfort zone. So let that manager come in and try and break those barriers down, or try and break down those misconceptions from the start. The third point is, get rid of the nitty-gritty as quickly as possible. When I say nitty-gritty, I mean the paperwork. Where do I park? Where do I get this? Who do I talk to about this? Those things really should be gotten, or you should really try and get them out of the way before day one, before that person steps in. Get all the paperwork done. As I mentioned, an individual needs to come in and hit the ground running as much as possible. So having them do seemingly inundating your new manager with these seemingly irrelevant things that's not contributing to the overall goal of this individual is just going to help them feel a little bit uneasy on day one. And then lastly, a team workshop. So a team workshop is where you allow the individuals to get to know your new manager. But more importantly, it's going to provide your new manager with the opportunity to experience the intricacies of that team that he or she is now leading. It's going to open his or her eyes up to the potential interactions, conflicts, and strengths within the team. And as I mentioned earlier, it allows them to gain that understanding and that compassion for different behavioral styles and different behavioral profiles. It allows them to explore different communication preferences, motivators, fears, and those kinds of things. That is really the best way to gel your team, especially if you've got a very difficult team that maybe hasn't gelled together very well in the past. That is most certainly a very good way to bring that team together. So that's all the content that I've prepared for you today. I'm going to now hand over to Alna for some questions that you might have asked.
Okay, Candice, so the first question is, if I have decided on the ideal personality traits for the position and the candidate does not match that, should I not consider them for the position any further? And will I be able to change the traits with training?
It's a very good question. Thank you. So no, we can't be that harsh. So we shouldn't look at the ideal personality traits as this is my cookie cutter and an individual needs to fit into this exactly, or we're not going to consider them at all. So that is not how we need to do it. We need to have a look at, okay, but this is my candidate's profile. How does this candidate's traits interact with the traits of the team. So we need to have a look at those interactions with personality. We can't be that black and white, because at the end of the day, there isn't a good and there isn't a bad. It's just who we are and how we're stitched together. So we need to see how those interactions are going to take place. And then the second part of the question, will I be able to change the traits with training? Technically, yes, but it takes a significant amount of effort and it takes a lot of work. So that isn't something that I would rely on as a fail-safe, and a lot of things can't be changed with training. So it would depend on exactly what it is that you would want to train.
Thank you, Candice. So the next and final question we have for you basically relates to what you just said. So the question is, how long would it take to develop a manager who has the technical skills? So he's an expert in his role, but he's lacking the people management soft side, of the skills.
Very good question. And how long? If we had a crystal ball, we can definitely put a time to that, but that's very, very difficult to answer, because everyone is going to develop at a different pace, and different people are going to value different things. So it comes down to, but does that person want to work on these things? Is this person aware of these things? If they are, then people and management skills is something you can work on, but you can't equate a time to it. It takes practice, it takes dedication, and it takes the sheer will to do so from that individual. Coaching is also something that can help that person, especially with regards to people skills. That's often a nice way to make sure that those skills are developed in the right way and in a safe way. Is there anything that you would like to add there, Elna?
No, I think you've covered it. So thank you, Candice. That's all the questions we have for you. So thank you for your time, and thank you for a very insightful session with us. I'm sure everyone learned a lot. And yes, you guys will receive an evaluation sheet that you can complete. And if you have any other questions for us, you can just reach out to either Candice or myself, or if you have a designated Thomas consultant, you can reach out to them. Candice?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Elna, and thank you everyone for making the time and joining us today. So enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Candice.
Thanks, Candice.
Thank you.